Tonight, you arrive in Rudolf the Second's Prague at the turn of the 17th century, a city of laboratories, observatories, and hidden vaults, where you serve as an imperial agent tracing a stolen letter said to promise the philosopher's stone amid scholars, painters, and alchemists who barter secrets like coin. If you enjoy this gentle journey, please consider subscribing. It helps us produce more stories. Now take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let candle smoke, ticking astrolabes, and the soft drift of the Vltava under stone bridges ease you toward rest as you move quietly through workshops and star-lit corridors in search of a truth calmer than gold. Prague around the year 1600 gathers itself around an emperor who prefers inquiry to warfare, and you move through streets shaped by that preference. Rudolf the Second has shifted the imperial seat to Hradčany, turning the castle into a hive of scholars, artisans, and seekers whose workbench odors mingle with incense from chapel altars. His patronage reaches from painters and engravers to mathematicians and instrument makers, and his reputation as a hermetic sovereign draws those who promise wonders of nature, as well as those who measure it with sextants and spheres. Tycho Brahe arrives to compile the heavens with naked-eye instruments of formidable size, and Johannes Kepler follows, refining planetary theories in rooms warmed by charcoal braziers and fueled by Tycho's numbers. The echoes of earlier visitors persist in conversations over wine. John Dee's angelic communications, set in cautious Latin notebooks, and Edward Kelly's bold claims of alchemical mastery, stories that drift through bohemian parlors long after the men themselves move on. In this late 16th and early 17th century atmosphere, astrology, metallurgy, natural philosophy, and hermetic texts do not conflict so much as overlap, and imperial prestige is negotiated as much with horoscopes and furnaces as with embassies and infantry. You understand that in such a court, whispered knowledge can travel faster than messengers, and a single manuscript can tilt the balance of credit and favor. The geography of the city frames this mingling of aspiration and craft, and you trace it as you cross the river in your work. The castle crowns the ridge at Hradčany, its halls wide enough to host festivals, and its cellars adapted as workshops where retorts glow faintly behind thick doors. Below, along the slopes of the lesser town, the Mala Strana, glass blowers and metal workers keep steady hours, their chimneys breathing through the night as they shape alembics, quadrants, and armillary rings. The Charles Bridge reaches toward the old town with a procession of statues not yet complete, while the old town's astronomic clock marks the passage of planets and saints to crowds who treat both as calendars of promise. Nearby stand mints and assay offices connected to imperial revenues, with the great silver of Kutna Hora only a ride away, and observatory platforms improvised on palace terraces where instruments catch the cold glitter of stars. The streets between are narrow and stone-paved, lined with taverns where recipes are traded under low beams and Latin fragments are copied in candlelight, and you know that messages travel here in folded slivers, sealed with wax and passed beneath tankards. Rudolf's Kunstkammer captures this world in miniature, and you visit it often in the course of your duties, for it adjoins rooms where papers multiply. The Cabinet of Curiosities is not merely a gallery, but a structured encyclopedia of marvels, presenting shells from distant shores, corals bleached into lace, miniature automata that stride a few inches before winding down, and clocks whose gears reveal the logic of timekeeping. Nearby sit terrestrial and celestial globes, astrolabes with delicate tracery, compasses in velvet, and telescopic prototypes that hint at new ways of seeing even before they are perfected. The categories that shape the collection, naturalia, artificialia, scientifica, blur at their edges, inviting visitors to ponder whether art improves nature or reveals it. Princes send gifts that double as arguments for alliance, and collectors compete to contribute a scene painting, a bezoar, a rare manuscript, each object a quiet letter of introduction. You see how this chamber functions as a diplomatic theatre as much as a museum, and you note how claims about the philosopher's stone would play here. Part marvel, part ledger entry, part promise of solvency. You are an imperial agent employed to keep this theatre from collapsing, and your current task presents itself without flourish. A letter rumored to contain the steps of transmutation is missing from the archive, and while you do not believe that metals obey syllables, you know that patrons and borrowers often do. The emperor's image as a sovereign of secrets depends on the aura that such documents cast, and the men who finance furnaces listen for hints of certainty, as bankers listen for coin on wood. If the paper exists and is thought to be genuine, it can reorganize who is owed what, and whether foreign envoys linger longer in Prague or write home with scorn. A skeptical mind becomes a practical tool in such a situation, and you accept that your work is not to assay gold, but to assay credibility. You make note of which creditors have not been paid from recent revenues, and which courtiers have lately boasted of breakthroughs, for rumour leaves fingerprints as surely as soot. The imperial archive sits in a secured suite near the Kunstkammer, and you step into a routine designed to prevent precisely this kind of absence. German and Czech clerks maintain inventories with tidy hands, copying incoming and outgoing letters into Latin registers before the originals are sealed with wax and dispatched to vaults or courts. Cipher ledgers sit under lock, signaling which correspondences were written in substitution alphabets or numeric wheels, and small notations indicate which keys the archivist on duty employed to decode them. Today the archivist, his collar smelling of starch and smoke, shows you a breach as if it were a bruise he cannot name. A folio box opened with a duplicate key, the ribbon loosened, and a single missing sheet traced by the faint, gritty outline left by gold leaf that once adhered to its margin. On the wooden lid is the ghost of a jot in a cryptic hand that does not match the clerk's, a flourish more common among the learned who ornament their Latin with personal monograms. The routine would have demanded that a copy be placed into the register before the original was filed. Yet here the register leaves a gap, a blank line between summaries where a title should have been. You note the exception without comment, and you write down names of those with keys and those with reasons to forget to copy. The initial roster of suspects forms easily because the city's needs are specific, and the crafts that serve them are few. Glass blowers who provide retorts, cucurbits, and alembics serve many masters and hear many confidences, and one family in the Mala Strana has lately supplied unusually large vessels to a patron who pays in foreign coin. An astrologer employed to draw horoscopes for envoys from the Habsburg lands and from Poland-Lithuania keeps a calendar of meetings that aligns too neatly with shipments of paper from Venice. A goldsmith, celebrated for pageant armor and festival props, is whispered to gild base metals for entertainments that flatter imperial vanity and calm creditors, and gilding leaves traces of leaf and gum in his shop that could match what you saw in the folio box. A scribe with an appetite for cryptographic treatises spends evenings in taverns teaching simple ciphers to students and complicating them for a fee, and his hands would know how to forge a notation that hinted at authenticity. Prague's taverns host these men nightly, and under the low light you have seen recipes for red oils and powders change hands alongside charters of patronage, their corners stained with wine. Foreign emissaries drift at the edges of these circles, and you mark their presence the way a night watchman counts lamps. Delegates from the Habsburg lands, cousins and rivals both, send aides to purchase instruments and papers, testing whether Prague's marvels are exportable. In their wake, Italian secretaries ask after manuscripts with diagrams and sealed signatures. Visitors from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth examine coins at the mint and inquire about metallurgical methods as though they were buying salt. And the questions seem casual until you consider the price of war and the value of bullion. In the taverns, coded notes pass beneath tankards, and sometimes the code is merely a change in handwriting or a shift in ink, the simplest steganography hiding in plain sight. You understand that information does not leave the city in trunks so much as in quotations and lists, and that a letter promising transmutation might also carry names and sums. Your suspicion settles on this possibility because the margins of such papers often hold the business of science. Who paid, who delayed, who swore discretion. A formula can be translated into any language, but a ledger of patrons binds specific men to specific promises. You proceed without haste because haste calls attention to itself, and the work asks for patience and a steady ear. In workshops you note the slant of labels tied to glass necks and the quiet clatter of instruments being set aside when you enter, and you ask after sand, potash, and cullet as if you were there to price materials. In the astrologer's chambers you watch the slow drawing of circles and the placement of planetary glyphs, and you request an ephemeral calculated for a day last week to gauge whether calculations and clients align. In the goldsmith's rooms you examine frames for pageant devices and the scraps of leaf on floorboards, counting the rate at which gold and imitation leaf are used, and you leave with the sense of which commissions are too grand for the coin that pays for them. In taverns you sit where drafts do not disturb parchment and accept that a recipe may be a cipher, and a cipher may be a receipt, and that both can be copied without leaving their originator poorer. Under candlelight, the laboratory glass around you takes on a soft, aquatic glow. Parchment breathes as it unrolls, and the murmur of balances and tongs provides a muted rhythm that steadies your thoughts while you begin to follow the trail of a letter that might, in truth, be a list. Morning finds you in the Malastrana glasshouses, where long brick furnaces breathe with a steady glow, and the air smells faintly of ash and river damp. Bohemian glass here takes on a pale green cast from iron in the sand and from potash, potassium salts leached from the forest's wood ash, that lowers the melting point and strengthens the wear. Artisans turn glowing gathers with slow wrists, shaping cucurbits and alembics, retorts with swan necks, and bulb-bellied receivers that will one day condense spirits or corrosive fumes. The city's laboratories depend on this quiet industry. Imperial stipends arrive in fits and starts, but orders do not stop, because a cracked alembic can ruin a month of distillations, and a cloudy receiver can mislead the eye. You note how the masters cool finished vessels in annealing ovens so the glass relaxes. Too quick a chill and the piece will craze. Too slow and the workshop loses the day's yield. In a court where reputations hinge on visible marvels, good glass becomes more than a container. It becomes a condition for trustworthy results. And the forests around Prague, both fuel and ash for potash, make this neighborhood a foundry of the emperor's experiments. The master glassblower, hands dusted with sand and ash, shows you a ledger written in a careful trade hand, symbols standing in for shapes to save space and privacy. A circle means a receiver, a circle sprouting a long neck marks a retort, a teardrop means a cucurbit, and a small crescent beside any mark notes a lid that must seal tight. He frowns at an entry from last week, a rush order paid in foreign thalers with a note that used alchemical signs instead of item names. Gold marked by a circle with a dot, silver indicated by a crescent, and a curious symbol like a circle crowned by a cross that he says some clients use for antimony. You ask about quality, and he answers like a man who has watched scholars quarrel over ambiguous vapors. Fine, clear potash glass resists sudden heat better than soda glass, and if the sand is well washed, the pale green does not grow into a haze that hides a color change. He adds that old cullet, broken glass remelted, can be a blessing or a curse. Too much, and the melt devitrifies, sugar frosting inside flasks that ought to be transparent. The foreign note bothers him, he admits, because it asked for pairs of vessels sized by the span of a hand, and that is a cipher of sorts. When the same hand spans 3 sizes, someone wants matched sets for a procedure or for staging. From the river you cross toward the old town, and step into a bookshop that leans into the university quarter, its shelves mixing classical reprints with more recent curiosities. A Latin polygraphia of Trithemius sits beside a French treatise by Vigenère on secret writing, their margins glossed by readers who disagree with both. On a high shelf rests a wooden cipher disc modeled on Alberti's invention, the inner alphabet paired with planetary signs so that the symbol of Saturn can stand for an offset you and your correspondent alone will know. You turn a codex of Paracelsian recipes and see familiar marks. The circle with a point for the sun and for gold, the crescent for the moon and for silver, the gallows-like emblem of Mercury for quicksilver, with its little horns above a circle perched upon a cross. Where the page mentions vitriol, the word itself carries weight in this period. Not only an acid made by distilling the sulfate salts called green and blue vitriol, but also a favorite acronym in alchemical circles, promising that by visiting the interior of the earth and rectifying, one will find the hidden stone. Beside it, someone has written aqua fortis, the strong water that corrodes silver and base metals, and aqua regia, the royal water that dissolves gold by mingling nitric and salt acids. Both belong to the real repertoire of the time, their fumes biting, their glassware etched if the craft is careless. Here, secrets are bound, sold, and footnoted, and you realize the stolen letter could hide in plain sight if it chose the right shelf and the right code. In a windowed room above a narrow stair, an astrologer lays out a brass quadrant, an armillary sphere with rings for the ecliptic, and a sextant with arms that slide and lock against minute scales. At Rudolf's court, the same hands draw horoscopes for princes and compute orbits for Mars. Tycho Brahe observed from Prague in his last years, and his successor, Johannes Kepler, calculates motions that will eventually reshape astronomy even as he writes charts to fund the work. The astrologer pours you watered wine and shows a natal figure annotated not with interpretations, but with a sequence of planetary hours. Saturn's hour, then Jupiter's, then Mars, an order that could key a simple polyalphabetic cipher if the weekdays and their rulers are agreed upon in advance. He explains without flourish that planetary hours divide the day and night into 12 unequal parts, each ruled by a planet in a repeating sequence, a useful schedule for the superstitious and an equally useful codebook for the pragmatic. He hints that a conjunction viewed from the Charles Bridge brought foreign eyes and domestic rivals together under the same sky, and that a parcel changed hands while watchers argued over whether the omen mattered. You note his instruments are well maintained, their verniers clean, and you wonder how many letters pass through this room under the pretense of calculating auspicious times. The goldsmith's workshop rings softly with mallets and burnishers, and the air carries a mineral sweetness from bole, the red clay ground with glue for water gilding. He explains the craft as he works. Genuine gold leaf is beaten from high carat metal until it behaves like breath on skin, clinging by static and laying without cracking, and when laid over bole and burnished with agate, it shines with depth and does not tarnish. Cheaper alloys make a leaf that looks bright at first but dulls, and the binder tells tales. Oil gilding holds in the damp but catches dust, while water gilding takes polish and reveals a smooth red underglow at the edges. Under good light you can find the seams and see whether the leaf crinkles in corners. A stage prop will betray itself with a greenish cast in time if brass lies beneath. The goldsmith smiles ruefully and admits he once disguised brass for a court pageant when budgets tightened, and that even careful men choose splendor over honesty when a mask demands wonder. He remembers, however, delivering leaf to a scribe in the castle quarter, paid with a promissory note bearing the signet of a noble household that has recently taken an interest in philosophical expenditures. You rest for a moment in a tavern where translators and secretaries exchange more paper than drinks, the tables strewn with brown ink, pounce, and crumbs. They copy recipes from letters and lift paragraphs from foreign posts, an old habit in a city where the imperial courier network branches like a river delta. The tax's postmasters move bags under seal, but human hands still touch what paper invites them to touch. Your method remains patient. You compare letter forms, note ligatures, and how scribes cross their T's, and turn scraps against the light to read the shadows of chain and laid lines. A watermark appears on one torn corner, a two-tailed lion like the arms of Bohemia bent into wire and sewn into a papermaker's mold, impressed during the wet press and visible whenever the sheet thins against a window. You jot that the paper is a rag stock, linen beaten to pulp, the watermark a badge that can anchor a folio to a mill and a season. You also note sealing wax fragments, their colors not arbitrary. Red common for private letters, black used for mourning, and green favored in some chancelleries for durable acts. All clues that help you sort private commerce from public business. Routes through Prague carry mandates and gossip alike, and it does not take drama to see how a single forged line in a letter could tilt a negotiation or end a pension. When you spread your notes on the tavern table, 3 threads lie side by side without tangling. A cipher keyed to planetary hours would make sense of the astrologer's schedule and the marginal planets you saw on the cipher disk. A source for counterfeit gold leaf explains a forged sheen on a document meant to dazzle, and a goldsmith's memory points to a scribe with access to materials and debts enough to sell a signature. A promissory note from a noble household ties purse strings to experiments that must remain discreet if the emperor's image as a patron of higher arts is to endure. You fold the paper and let the city's murmur carry your thoughts toward the next door to knock, the next ledger to open, and the next seal to study under soft light. A clerk from the mint finds you near the old town square and reports, in a low and practiced voice, that a miraculous recipe is passing from bench to bench in the taverns. He says the talk is of a letter rescued from the emperor's own chests, a guide to turning base metal obedient under the hand, and the men who whisper it are buying drinks they cannot pay for. You follow him through streets still damp from a brief rain, past stalls of glassware and quicklime, to a taproom where the walls are smoked dark and the tables tilt with use. There, a folded sheet moves like contraband from fingers stained with soot to fingers ink-blotted at the tips. You offer coin for a copy, and it comes, pressed into your palm with the caution of someone handling a live coal. By the light that reaches through a mullioned window, you see hurried Latin, crossings out, and a margin freckled with astrological emblems meant to announce authority. You read the letter slowly and find its voice unsure, the Latin slipping as if the scribe borrowed grammar the way he borrowed ideas. A passage demands vitriolum communem et acetum in the accusative, where the construction requires an ablative, and the verbs knit unevenly, leaving participles unmoored from their subjects. A scholastic quotation drops in without context. Ut dicit in meteorologicorum, as if the writer hoped that naming Aristotle would sanctify the recipe without placing it in any argument. At the close, a swaggering flourish apes the cut of a printed colophon, with a little hand pointing, a decorative tail, and the claim, per manum fidelissimam, a stock phrase more likely to appear in a typesetter's box of ornaments than in a genuine scholar's correspondence. The author's hand imitates the rolling elegance of a humanist script, but the long S and the R's are inconsistent, and the abbreviation marks stand where no trained letter writer would put them. Even in its content, the recipe trips. It confuses stages of the work, treats terms as if they were charms, and promises that common vitriol washed with vinegar grants the leap from alloy to gold without residue. You pause and note the terms as a steward of evidence, because words matter in this court where symbols and experiments compete for trust. Calcination, as many artisans in your city use the word, means driving off the volatile by steady heat until a substance becomes friable and ash-like, a preparation for further solution. Sublimation means coaxing a body up the alembic as vapor, so it reappears as a crystalline or powdery deposit on a cooler surface. The forgery tangles them, asking you to sublime what wants to be calcinated, as though lifting the heavier parts by smoke, which is a promise to chase mist. Caput mortuum, literally the deadhead, is here used for a triumphant product, when in the practice of many still rooms it names the inert residue left after distillation, often the iron-red remnants that remain when vitriol has given up its spirits. Real recipes for tinctures of gold in this period do not pretend to raise gold from nothing, but speak of drawing a color or a medicinal virtue from gold by dissolving or digesting it, using aqua fortis, repeated distillation of spirit of wine, or the agency of antimonial preparations. The letter's implausible claim about transmutation with vitriol, common, and vinegar sounds less like a process and more like tavern boast, and your pencil marks the line with a small circle that means attention, not belief. You set the sheet flat and blow to dry the ink of your notes. In the courtyard of a merchant's house near the river, an ambitious alchemist stages a demonstration traced, he says, from the letter's orders, and you join a small watching ring. He lays charcoal, sets a crucible, and passes around a tiny packet of powder, urging patience, reminding everyone that the art prefers quiet to applause. When he tips the metal from the fire, it glows with the promise that attaches itself to all molten light, and a murmur passes, slow and hopeful. He cools the surface with a breath and a cloth, then scrapes, and the thin shine lifts in little curls to reveal brass beneath, yellow as straw where the gilding flakes away. You observe without scorn. Is it a trick learned from goldsmiths who use mercury to lay a film of gold, or an earnest misreading of the letter's steps, or something between the two that often happens when patron and practitioner negotiate what knowledge is worth? Such demonstrations, you recall, are common at Rudolph's court, where experiment is both spectacle and trial, and an error can be an honest footnote as much as a ruse. The finances beneath these spectacles creak like beams under snow, and you note them as part of the weather of inquiry. Many of the city's practitioners live on stipends from nobles and magistrates, and their days are measured in purchases of charcoal, crucibles, glass flasks, and vitriol, all secured on credit that softens as soon as a patron nods. The long Turkish War pulls at the same purse, stretching imperial coin toward the frontier, and the court's appetite for marvels must share with soldiers' rations and powder for cannon. In this climate, a promise of transmutation is not only chemistry but economics, a letter that could convert debt into salary if its seal looks bright enough from across a room. Merchants near the Charles Bridge gossip of payments delayed and of ledgers carried in the sleeve, and they tolerate risk until a rumor makes the risk seem urgent. Then they tighten terms like strings at a lute. Disputes surface in workshops and taverns, mostly as brief quarrels over unfinished orders or unpaid cords of wood, more sigh than shout, and the city's watch prefers to remind rather than to seize. You write these pressures as background, a soft pressure that bends people toward decisions they might not make in calmer weather. In a narrow room above a scrivener's stall, you interview the suspected scribe who copied the false letter, and he greets you with a blend of pride and apology. He says his motive is to advance the emperor's higher science by drawing attention to neglected truths, and he confesses that he filled the page with phrases gleaned from older notebooks, seasoning them with Paracelsian talk of spagyric separations, the tria prima of sulfur, mercury, and salt, and a promise of an arcanum that would redeem base things. He admits to brushing counterfeit gold leaf across a heading, to impress a buyer who believes a sheen signals an origin in court, and he shows you the cushion and gilder's knife he used. You examine the sheet and the quill, noting the broad cut that produces a display italic inconsistent with the smaller humanist hand in the body, and the ink that sits brown-black, the iron gall solution heavy with verdigris. A particular grammatical error repeats in a way you have seen in a printed folio in the university shop, a mispunctuated citation and a malformed abbreviation, which tells you he leaned on a page he did not fully understand. Printers leave fingerprints too. You explain, almost conversationally, that catchwords at the foot of each page anticipate the first word of the next sheet to guide binders, and that a decorative fleuron or a repeated woodcut ornament can betray the workshop that first set the phrase. So a forged manuscript that echoes those marks whispers its source to anyone who listens. By afternoon, the forgery hums through the city as more than paper, and you track its small, measurable effects. At the riverfront stalls, saltpeter climbs a few pfennigs by the basket, and antimony cakes sell faster than their last shipment can be promised. The vendors shrug and say they simply match what the next bench is charging. A minor patron, seeking a reputation for discernment, stands on a crate and announces stipends for anyone who can supply the missing step that makes vinegar and vitriol something more than cleaning agents, and a hopeful circle tightens around him. Honest artisans tell you in quiet voices that they fear the rush for secrets will eclipse the slow work of refining glass thickness and improving furnace bricks, the labor that keeps workshops safe and productive. You write down prices with the care of a quartermaster and note a guild notice nailed by the bridge reminding shopkeepers to extend credit only to known customers until the quarter's dues are settled. Near a stall selling compasses and astrolabes, you see a foreign agent weighing a purse in exchange for a bundle of notebooks tied with string, his eyes turned away from the crowd as if watching a distant weather. When you return to your desk, you lay the forged letter open and look past its noisy promises into the margins, where the zodiac signs sit like a border of little animals and instruments. The ram of Aries has an extra curl, Taurus's horns are adjusted by a notch, and Virgo's star holds 6 points instead of 5. The changes are too small to impress a tavern, but deliberate enough to suggest a count. You match them to a cipher the astrologer showed you earlier in the week, a system where modified signs mark numbers that unravel into letters, and the pattern emerges with slow clarity. Names begin to appear between the lines, a ledger set into ornament, a list masked as magic. The letter's false chemistry is a veil, you conclude, and the true substance is financial, a map of those who pay and those who receive. You close the shutters, secure the sheet under a paperweight, and prepare your next steps with the same calm you bring to any experiment that might heat a room more than it seems. You sit at a narrow desk where the candle has burned a calm crater in its own wax, the forged copy arrayed beside your notes like a patient awaiting diagnosis. You begin with the margins, where small sigils drift between lines, a ram's horn for Aries, a scythe for Saturn, a crescent for the moon, all placed as if they were talismans rather than letters. You test the planetary hour cipher, a method common in this century's circles of natural philosophy, where the sequence of the 7 planets, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, rotates with each hour after sunrise to create a shifting key. You count from the day's dawn, match the governing planet to a letter row, then let the zodiacal signs stand as substitutes that conceal the underlying Latin, and you mark certain alchemical doodles, retort, salamander, pelican, as nulls meant to mislead any casual reader. You let the key slide forward by one with each hour mark implied by tiny ink pricks, which a hasty reader would mistake for ornament, and the jumble settles into syllables that hold together. You find that the text does not describe calcination or cohobation at all. It names people, places, and sums that enter the page one cautious figure at a time, and your doubt turns into the cool recognition of a ledger wrapped in a cloak of transmutation. You thread the symbols into words and watch proper names surface. A Bohemian lord with estates near the Elbe, a Silesian official from the Mint at Breslau, and a merchant whose family partners with Augsburg moneyed houses, their sigils recognizable even when disguised. You see dates in Roman numerals and amounts tallied as florins and thalers, sometimes with a moon sign to indicate a deferred payment, and a sun sign to mark a sum rendered in ready coin. You annotate carefully, because in Rudolf's realms patronage often flows through private channels, nobles extending stipends to philosophers and artisans in exchange for instruments, pigments, or counsel, and then quietly recouping prestige or profit if the work yields. You note that the imperial mints rely on the continuity of silver from mines like Kutna Hora, where the flow of ore determines not only coinage but also confidence, and any talk of new methods can tilt expectations about fineness and supply. You recall that crowns across the Holy Roman Empire negotiate loans with merchant bankers who weigh a ruler's credit against his reputation for prudence or progress, so rumors of success in laboratories can soften interest rates just as quickly as doubts harden them. You see at once why such a list remains dangerous. It joins the language of philosophy and the arithmetic of power, and it invites any observer to confuse the two. You pause to sketch the wider ledger that underlies the one before you, the empire's own balance sheet as the century turns. You acknowledge the drain of the long Turkish War, whose long campaigns rattled treasuries from Vienna to Prague, and demand payments to soldiers, suppliers, and fortifications that cannot be deferred without risk. You consider the patchwork structure of the Holy Roman Empire, where imperial authority moves by consent and negotiation, and where regional estates weigh their obligations against their own interests. You remember that Rudolf cultivates the image of a hermetic monarch, a unifier of knowledge whose Kunstkammer gathers instruments and marvels to suggest a macrocosm held together by his serene curiosity. You understand that a clandestine ledger showing noble stipends, mint officers' disbursements, and merchant advances, some perhaps routed through foreign envoys, would give rivals in courts near and far cause to shame, bargain, or threaten. You recall that Prague itself houses institutions with distinct stakes, the mint watching for debasement with assay knives and touchstones, the city council wary of unrest among artisans, the university's scholars seeking stipends that steady their lectures and presses, and the imperial secretariat preferring ambiguities that can be managed over scandals that cannot. You carry the forged copy folded into your sleeve and go quietly to the mint, where a clerk receives you with the alert fatigue of a man who knows coin by weight, smell, and ring. He admits that variations in fineness have been logged in recent months, not as policy but as the inevitable ripple of ore quality and furnace behavior, and that such notes become rumors the moment they leave a ledger. He shows you how assayers test with bone ash cupels to draw lead away from silver, watching for the moment a bright bead forms, and how a single misfired furnace can skew a batch enough to start talk of debasement. He explains that official stance remains conservative, that the mark and the date on each thaler commit the mint to a standard the emperor cannot afford to betray, while mercenaries tally their pay. He also mentions, almost ruefully, that the suggestion of a new method, an additive for flux, a way to pre-roast ore, can travel faster than proof, and that some investors read such hints as near-term promises. You depart with respect for his precision, and with a sharper sense of how a cipher that looks like a recipe can stir both hope and fear in a house built on assay. You next sit in a tiled antechamber, while a noble's steward counts rents from distant villages, and then speaks with you about annuities paid to an alchemist experimenting with mineral acids. He names aqua fortis for biting into silver and aqua regia for dissolving gold, though the latter remains more curiosity than tool in a minting realm. And he describes the hope that better controls on corrosion might clean ores more efficiently. He mentions practical aims couched in hermetic phrases, improved cupellation to separate silver from lead with less loss, furnaces that waste less charcoal by using drafted air and warmer chimneys, and safer distillation to make volatile oils without shattering vessels. He speaks of water wheels that drive stamp mills to break ore, and of new glazed earthenware retorts that resist the sting of vitriol, the ordinary work of metallurgy dressed in the garments of mystery to attract attention and funding. He concedes that a man paid to speak of quintessences often spends his hours solving the problem of smoke in the flues or slag in the molds, which is exactly what his patron requires if yields rise. You note quietly that many projects at court are like this: practical experiments wrapped in noble language, their outcomes measured by weight, not wonder. You dine under frescoed ceilings with a foreign emissary who praises the emperor's glory and speaks of a universal reformation of learning, phrases that hover like incense over the table and mean little to the uninitiated and much to those who trade influence. You watch his hand lift a cup and see a ring whose crest you recognize from the cipher, not a word but a device that links a payment to a person. You do not press. You let him talk about instruments purchased in Padua, manuscripts copied in Venice, and a lens grinder in the Low Countries who may yet deliver a spyglass that tames the clouds. You understand the diplomatic stakes. Italian princes and Polish magnates court the same practitioners who orbit Prague, and they buy recipes, notebooks, and apparatus with the same patience that they buy information. You know that copying and selling formulas is common custom, that secrecy agreements lapse into courtesies the moment a patron changes his mood or a scholar changes his address, and that the market for knowledge lives on duplication rather than scarcity. You leave the table with a cordial bow and the calm certainty that ciphers and coats of arms already do more work than any oath of silence. You return to your desk and draw a line under your notes, because the pattern now sits in view. You judge that the stolen original most likely held the clean list of patrons, terms, and dates without any gilded nonsense, and that the so-called formula served as the veil, advice to calcine an egg of brass sprinkled with philosophical dew, a deterrent for prying eyes. You see how the forged version, with its coarse Latin and counterfeit gold leaf, amplified the ruse and scattered the players as buyers and debtors repositioned themselves beneath a cloud of rumor. You accept that public exposure would injure Rudolf's carefully tended image as a wise hermetic monarch, the very persona that stabilizes his bargaining position with nobles, mints, and merchants who wish to believe they finance a steady hand. You recognize that a ledger unmasked would provide pretexts to withdraw credit, to halt stipends, or to use the emperor's own rhetoric against him, and that your role favors quiet correction over noisy revelation. You write your conclusion in a steady hand, spell the century in words as scribes in this city prefer for clarity, and keep your narrative in the present so that your steps move without jolt from one room to the next, the better to preserve the fragile stillness you serve. You wait on the castle heights where the observatory's timber platforms breathe softly in the night, and the city spires lean like dark reeds against a star-sprinkled sky. The great brass quadrant gleams with a cold luster, its arc engraved in tiny numerals that Tycho Brahe's assistants once traced by lantern, while a mural arc along the wall fixes altitude with a steadiness no human hand can match. A small furnace, kept here to temper metal fittings and straighten bent sighting vanes, gives off a patient heat that smells of ash and steel. Around you, Prague holds its breath. Kilns banked, taverns dimmed, the river tucked into the valley like a quiet ribbon, while the court above you remains a labyrinth of projects. Rudolf the Second has drawn to this hill a republic of curiosity. Painters and instrument makers, astrologers and natural philosophers, collectors and bold persuaders, all pledging to convert secrets into prestige. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the emperor's chambers become both cabinet of wonders and workshop, a place where a well-made astrolabe matters as much as a well-turned phrase. You stand in that mixture, skeptical but attentive, knowing that even imagined knowledge can move money, promises, and armies. You meet the scholar you trust, a cautious figure who keeps the star catalogues in order and copies numbers with the fidelity of a lens grinder. Together you spread the suspect pages on a bench, your breath lifting a fragile edge of gold leaf from the margin, and you compare the ciphers' symbols against the shorthand tables you have already worked out in less public hours. The night ticks forward with the slow squeak of wood shrinking and the faint shift of a worm gear on the quadrant, as if the instruments themselves keep time with your reading. Your colleague traces the repeated signs that pose as alchemical stages, calcination, dissolution, conjunction, and shows how they align with a roster of names, not elements, families whose funds have been poured into clandestine experiments. You consider what a public disclosure would bring, and the thought flows like cold water. Patrons named and shamed, creditors tightening their grip, foreign envoys whispering that Rudolf entertained charlatans while neglecting accounts. Rivals would claim victory at no cost, and the intricate credit that sustains the workshops could contract in a week. You nod to the scholar, and in that nod you accept that truth can be a lever, or a hammer, and that not all blows land where justice intends. You pause to weigh the court's ledger of achievement against its credulous wagers, and the balance does not rest easily, but it does exist. Under Rudolf's protection, Johannes Kepler calculates with stubborn care, drawing from Tycho's observations conclusions that will reshape astronomy, even if their full sum lies some years ahead in Astronomia Nova and the later Rudolphine tables. Instrument makers in Prague, Erasmus Habermal among them, fashion armillary spheres, sundials, and sighting devices whose precision invites a different kind of faith, the faith that repeated measurement leads closer to the world as it is. The Kunstkammer swells with wonders, some fanciful but many instructive, establishing a pattern of collecting that later museums will domesticate and catalogue. At the same time, the city has hosted men who promise too much: transmutation upon command, angels in crystals, gold raised from vinegar and ash, stories that enchant a weary monarch. You know that Rudolph's generosity shelters both the careful and the reckless, and that the credit of the careful depends on the silence that smothers the recklessness. You breathe in, and the furnace answers with a faint, even sigh. You decide quietly, the way you have carried this case from the first rumour to the last column of figures, and you feed the dangerous document to the forge. The parchment stiffens and lifts, the counterfeit gold leaf wrinkling into tiny dunes before it gives in and melts to dull flakes, and the ink browns like autumn leaves. A page that pretended to be a recipe for perfection curls into itself and becomes a cinder. And you think of how many recipes begin and end with heat. Your colleague watches, not approving and not protesting, simply present for the passing of a possibility. You feel no triumph. You are taking weight off a structure that would not bear it, and that is all. You let the embers settle and, with a pair of tongs, push the last recognizable seal under the coals until it winks out of shape. In the soft orange light, the observatory's quadrant looks like a moon half risen, and its stillness steadies your hands for writing. You compose a report shaped to the bureaucracy of the time, careful, sober, and unprovocative, and you let the Latin carry the tone of order. You begin with place and date, Prague in Arce, die lunae, then cite the archive shelf and number, inventari numerus CCL Siccusvate fasciculus tertius, followed by a brief narrative that attributes the disturbance to foreign instigation without naming a power, sub specie literarum chemicarum machinatione externa. You fold in witness statements, testimonio juratorum archivari et famulorum, recorded as short depositions attached on separate leaves, each endorsed in a different hand, then mark the chain of custody. Clausum et signatum sub cera rubra cum filis seritis. You enclose a harmless cipher key, a neat little clavis minor that invites the reader to transpose letters by 3 places and arrive at innocuous phrases about glass composition, ending in a blank that suggests further work while promising nothing. You recommend, with the dry precision of a clerk, measures that could have prevented the affair. Duplicate ledgers at different locations, keys held by separate officers with staggered hours, a chest with multiple locks requiring 2 present hands to open, foliation of volumes to prevent substitution, and regular audits that record watermarks and bindings. Early modern record-keeping thrives on friction, numbered pages, cross-referenced catalogues, seals impressed so they must be broken to be read, and you let that friction be your counsel, so that the next curious visitor meets paper that pushes back. You sign the report in the expected fashion, scriptum et subsignatum, manu propria, and you press a seal that leaves a clean impression, a small sun with radiating lines around the arms of the empire. You hand a copy to the scholar for safekeeping, a duplicate placed in a separate coffer, and you leave instructions for the porter whose duty rosters will now include irregular checks at the archive door. You pause by the furnace once more, not to look for remains, but to listen to the air return to its ordinary hush as the last glow withdraws. You step into the night, and Prague accepts you without remark, the platforms quiet, the mural arc a pale stripe under the stars. You pass the sleeping glass houses of the artisans whose work will resume with the morning bell, the furnaces still warm, the annealing ovens resting between tasks. The descent from the castle feels measured rather than long, and the cobbles take your tread as if they had been expecting it. You cross the Charles Bridge while the Vltava learns the first colours of day, a thin pewter light on the water deepening slowly to grey-blue, then something close to silver. Stone saints keep their mild company, and the river carries a few stray reeds past the bridge piers, each eddy a moving script you cannot read and do not need to. You think of transmutation and find that the word stretches well beyond the alembic, describing how ambition becomes survival when channeled, how rumor condenses into policy when clarified, how fear, given time, settles into restraint. You do not congratulate yourself, and you do not mourn a moment that is not yours to mourn. You simply keep walking as the sky lightens. A baker's window brightens in the old town, and somewhere a watchman's staff taps its steady pattern, counting a city back into motion. You carry forward a quiet conviction that what endures tonight is not a tale of conjured gold, but a fragile order that gives scholars and craftsmen a chance to measure, to draw, to check again. You let the city's history settle around you like a cloak, and you return for a moment to the broader frame in which your night has unfolded. Rudolf the Second's Prague is a crossroads where superstition and reason share the same corridors, where a cryptic letter can unsettle balances in guild halls and counting rooms, and where modern science edges forward among astrolabes, ledgers, and patient observation. The emperor's fascination with alchemy invites dreams that spill into debt, yet his patronage also anchors the careful work that will outlast the dreams, in tables calculated and instruments etched and collections described. You accept that both strands wind through these streets, and you have chosen to knot them, not to cut them. You offer your report to the morning with a steady hand and keep your pace unhurried, because the day ahead will be long enough for many voices. You let the bridge's final stone step bring you into the old town's awakening, and you keep your counsel as the Vltava takes the light and carries it east. You breathe once more, and you make your way toward the archives, content to leave the stars to the astronomers and the embers to their ash. Night thins to a pale ribbon over the Vltava, and you move through the quiet streets with the simple relief of finishing a careful task. Lantern wicks hiss. Frost lifts from the cobbles. The city that once pressed in with whispering doors and hungry ledgers now feels light, almost weightless, like breath leaving a window pane. You are not triumphant and not defeated. You are simply present, carried on by the slow, reasonable rhythm that has guided your steps all along. In Rudolf's Prague, so much lives at the edge between wonder and ledger book. Lenses ground until stars sharpen, furnaces coaxed until sand remembers it can be glass. People arrive with pockets full of promises and leave with ink stains that stand in for wealth. You have learned how each claim of transmutation rests on arrangements of debt and trust, on the geometry of patronage, and on the quiet mathematics of reputation. Perhaps that is why, when dawn comes, the city seems honest. Its towers are just stone again, its river just water turning silver, and you at last are allowed the gentler alchemy of returning to the ordinary. You think of the observatory's brass circles cooling in the night air, of numbers plotted against the dark. There is comfort in a calculation completed, in a cipher dissolved back into plain speech. The letter is gone to ash, and in that ash is a small freedom, not a victory, not a loss, but a clearing of ground. If anyone asks what was found, you will offer only what helps them sleep, a version of the truth that leaves the city standing. This, too, is a kind of craft, taking heat out of the world until it holds its shape. Somewhere, an astrologer will wake and adjust a chart. A glassblower will turn the blowpipe and listen for the soft change in tone as the bulb rounds out. You think of their work with quiet respect. They do not demand gold from lead. They ask only to make something clear, something useful, something that catches the day. You have chosen the same. You have not turned base into noble. You have turned noise into silence, danger into distance, hunger into a measured breath. As the sun touches the castle, you feel how thin a line runs between curiosity and fear, between credulity and hope. It is not a line to be policed so much as balanced on, step by careful step. The hermetic monarch gathers his savants, the city gathers its shadows, and you gather yourself. You have learned that knowledge is not a fire to be let loose, but a lamp to be shaded, so it lights the next small piece of road without burning the house that shelters it. When the bells begin, their sound is rounded and low, gentle as a hand smoothing a page. You turn once more toward the river and let the morning hold you. The work has given the day a clean edge. The future will come in ordinary measures, a letter sealed, a conversation by a window, a ledger balanced, a star consulted, a glass cooling on the bench. And in that measuredness is the only philosopher's stone you require, the slow transmutation of urgency into understanding. You breathe, and the city breathes with you, steady and unhurried. The water moves past its bridges. The bells fade. The light settles. You allow your eyes to close on a Prague that has softened back into itself, and you let the quiet carry you, peaceful and complete.